Zero diver. You know what? Can we skip this? NDAF. Perfect.
Howdy, howdy. This is Mark Wheaton, and welcome to another episode of NDAF, a space in which neurodivergent folks and their friends can talk all things spectrumy in any messy direction they want. With me as sometimes is my silent, never-speaking producer and engineer, Ken Plume. This week, we're speaking with author Vesper Doom. Vesper wrote a book I recently had the pleasure of reading entitled The Binding of Bloom Mountain, described as an adult, cozy fantasy folk horror. It tells the story of a young woman, Celeste Foster, who, in a plot point that couldn't be more relevant, loses her job with the Forestry Service due to a government-mandated reduction in force. Soon needing money, she answers an ad looking for a hiker to make an overnight trek deep into the Appalachian Mountains. You think you know where this is going? You absolutely do not. I read the book in barely 2 days as I couldn't put the witchy, beautiful, and romantic book down. Without further ado, here's Vesper. Welcome to the show, Vesper. You said online you're in the greater DC area. Where are you? And where are you from originally?
So I'm originally from Chicago. I was born and raised there. And when I was 8 or so, my family moved to the East Coast. And I've kind of been in the DC area since then.
So when you started writing, about how old were you? Were you already in DC? Were you in Chicago? When did you start?
I was about 8 when I started. So one of the spelling assignment options was to write a story with our spelling words. So I ended up writing stories about my dog doing various things. Like he went to space and he joined the circus, things like that.
Oh, that's fantastic. What's your dog's name?
Rio.
Rio?
Yeah.
And now that the story I just read obviously has very alive and very animated and very real animal characters. Since you started with a dog, have you always written about animals in that way?
No. It just, the animals seemed very appropriate for the setting for Bloom Mountain. So it just kind of happened that way.
If you could talk a little about how your writing evolved from like classroom spelling project into doing more stories and eventually into novels now.
Yes.
When did you know it wasn't a hobby? It was something you really wanted people to see. And how did you begin to be more, take it professionally?
So I wrote off and on throughout school, a lot of bad poetry, as teenagers are wont to write, some short stories. And I realized quickly that I always kind of veered towards horror as a theme. Then I took a break for college. And at the end of college, I started writing again all the time. And I knew then that was what I wanted to do with my life. I just didn't know how I was going to get there. And then in 2021, I was editing a novella and my husband's like, you can just self-publish that. And he was like that for like a month. Basically every day is like, you could self-publish that. And so I just kind of gave up and self-published it.
What was the title? What's the title of that one?
Out on the Ice. It's not available anymore, but I'm working on a rewrite of it to be re-released.
When you say you started working in horror, kind of what were you reading? What were you seeing? What was the kind of horror that made you want to get into it? Or did you just come to it devoid of anything else you were reading or watching?
So when I started writing horror was around the time that I started reading Lovecraft. I was 12 or 13 when my mom bought me a copy of like his greatest stories, and the settings and the cosmic horror of it all really captured my imagination. And I guess I just absorbed that into my own writing.
Did you ever, if you grew up in Chicago and you moved to DC, Lovecraft is can be rural, can be coastal. Did you have any experience with those places, or was that so off the beaten path? It was like, this mysterious, curious thing to investigate.
So I actually did have a lot of experiences with rural places growing up. I currently live in the Shenandoah Valley, which is pretty rural and is right. The basis for the world of the valley in Bloom Mountain. So I came out here a lot as a kid. One of my aunts and uncles lives in Winchester. We'd come out here for Thanksgiving every other year. And I had grandparents and other family members who lived in rural Kansas, rural Illinois, along the coast of Maine. So I did spend a lot of time in rural areas as a kid.
You hike a lot, like Celeste?
I used to.
Okay.
Actually, Celeste's hike is based on Old Rag, which is a hike in Shenandoah National Park. It's like
And that's close to you?
yes, I actually live right by the northern entrance to Shenandoah National Park.
Obviously, a lot of both this and, as hinted, but I haven't read it, in your next piece, talk about autism. Do you know when you were diagnosed? Did you self-diagnose? Or when did you kind of realize there was neurodivergence happening in your life?
I always knew there was something, I guess, off about me. I knew growing up that my grandfather and uncle were autistic, but it was, the 90s and early aughts, and they didn't really believe that AFAB people could be autistic.
Right.
Or they weren't really open to thinking that. I got my diagnosis in 2022, so 3 years ago, when I was writing Bloom Mountain, and I kind of used Bloom as a way to process the diagnosis, to really see how it affected my life, the things I do, the stims I have, and that has moved on into Metropolis Down, which is my next novel.
It took me years to write about autism, to even know how to talk about it. I was writing fiction and movies and stuff long before my own, and I never felt quite prepared to write about it because I was like, oh, I'll get this wrong. I'll get that wrong. I didn't trust my individualized experience of it. You obviously did, and it comes across on the page beautifully. Did you have a lot of confidence going in? Did you say, okay, I know I can write this. I know I can execute this?
I went into it with a lot of anger, a lot of trauma, as a lot of us autistic people have. And I just really needed a place to work that out. And the more I wrote Celeste and her journey, the more I realized that I was putting myself into the story through my own experiences and the traits. So it just kind of was a happy coincidence that I started writing this book right before I got my diagnosis. But if you look at my earlier works, you can tell that the main characters were autistic as well. They just didn't have the right words for it, because I didn't have the right words for it.
There seems to be a lot of that when I talk to writers and screenwriters who do that. It's like, oh, I didn't know. But then even on this podcast, it's been like, well, this character and this, and this character and this, and this. It's like a constellation where you suddenly realize, oh, wait, no, you're absolutely right. I've been writing this the whole time, yet I didn't know that it didn't have a name yet.
Yeah,
So
that's definitely how it was for me. Like while I was working on this rewrite of Out on the Ice, I realized that I made Minerva, the main character, very autistic. She has a lot of social anxiety, a lot of stubbornness, and I'm going to crank that up a bit during this rewrite.
right. What has been the kind of response from autistic readers on Bloom Mountain? Especially, I know for myself, I recognize the social interactions at the beginning, but just the appeal of the sensory world of the mountain. If no one else spoke in the entire book, I would have just kept creeping through that as a reader and really just enjoyed how you wrote that.
I'd say overall, a lot of people felt themselves seen for the first time in a book. Some people have since gotten their own diagnoses because my book and Celeste impacted them that much, which is a very humbling thing to say, to think that you led someone else to their own self-discovery. I've had a couple people who said that, they recognized she was autistic, but it didn't really vibe with them and their autism. But that's been a minority of autistic people.
When you were younger, were there ever characters that even before your diagnosis, you were reading or you were seeing, and even if they were utterly hackneyed in their execution, you're like, oh, wait, there's a percentage of that's me. There's a part of that thing. I hate all this stuff, but was there stuff you were reading and watching that you now are like, oh, I related to that because then you're a divergence of that character?
So it was actually a book that led me to realizing I was autistic, and that was Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because it has an AFAB autistic love interest, and I had never felt seen before I read her book. There was always, characters like Spock is very autistic coded. And, he was my favorite growing up because I felt like I understood him better than maybe other people in my family. But Into the Drowning Deep was a moment that I felt seen. And there's been a lot of books that I really love where there are autistic characters or autistic coded characters. And that helped reinforce my decision to get diagnosed.
Like what? Do you know? Can you tell me some of the examples, or are they just there's a panoply of characters?
There's a whole bunch of them. I've always seen the biologist in Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation as autistic. Right. The main character of The Haunting of Hill House gives autistic vibes. And of course, now I've forgotten every other book I've ever read.
Right. I think what I liked so much about Into the Drowning Deep is I grew up in so many TV characters that were autism coded. Like you weren't allowed to be autistic or welcomed until you did something to like help the neurotypicals, or you solved a mystery, or you did the right dance. Mm-hmm. And Into the Drowning Deep, the autistic character is just part of the gang. There's not some superpower that suddenly emerges. She's just there, and she's there to like host the show, and she's great.
Yeah, she's basically there to be pretty. And then she also ends up being very useful as a character. And it's like, that was really what made me feel seen, is like, you don't have to be like a scientist like my grandfather or a historian like my uncle. You don't have to be someone who's necessarily important in that same way. You just can be a person.
We can go on to The Binding of Blue Mountain. I don't even know where to begin, but I guess I'll start with witchcraft. When you start talking about the supernatural aspects, and when you started writing about the supernatural aspects of Binding of Blue Mountain, were you pulling from kind of folklore you knew? Were you inventing whole cloth? Kind of where does kind of the supernatural aspects of it come from?
So I'd say the vast majority of the supernatural aspects I created from scratch. A lot of it's just based on the vibes out here in the valley, vibes in Appalachia, Blue Ridge Mountains, especially on like foggy mornings when you're driving on back roads, because there's a lot of byways here in Virginia. So you get a lot of very rural, kind of creepy areas that you can drive through. And my imagination just went wild. It just kept coming up with stories and creatures. And I found a way to incorporate that into the book.
Have you ever had experiences yourself where you're driving and either something actually happened or your mind starts being like, the storytelling aspect takes over and starts filling in gaps of what's in the fog? Have you ever had it?
Yeah, that happens to me all the time. Usually it's just little fragments of something, little, one line or two line snippets that come to mind. This is actually this is kind of how the book came into being, because on a mountain south of the town I live in, there's a giant oak tree on the side of a mountain. And every time we passed by this mountain on the interstate, I would be like, well, what would this tree, what significance would this tree have in a magical or folkloric idea? And I came up with the old oak tree and the hangman, and the whole novel spiraled from there.
How soon from seeing the tree to getting the first draft?
I'd say about a year. I didn't at first intend to write a whole novel about it, but the longer I wrote it, the more I realized that this would be an important story for me to tell.
Because I have kids myself, and we've just devoured in their youth a number of the Miyazaki films. I hope you don't mind the comparison. But there are total Miyazaki vibes in Blue Mountain. I don't know if that's intended or if you're just on the same train track as he is, but it really beautifully wove the nature and the invader into the story. Are you a fan? Is that something that you were like,
I'm a huge fan. Around the time I was writing the book, my husband and I were on a Miyazaki binge. So we watched almost all of the movies, and I definitely subconsciously took some of the themes that he has, the man versus nature, and put that into the book. And Bloom is Bloom is sometimes compared to Princess Mononoke because of the conflict of man versus nature there.
I after reading it, wanted to see. And so I popped it in last week on HBO and was like, oh yeah, I can totally. So I'm not going to be like totally off base mentioning this next week. So I was like, there's this thing.
Yeah.
But to that, at the end of the book, you have portraits that you drew of the characters. Do you also draw the monsters? How visual do you go with that?
The art in the back of the book was actually done by a friend of mine. I commissioned them to do that. My writing and my art are very different. I mostly paint a lot of abstract space scenes, which have nothing to do with my actual books, so to speak.
Okay. In the next book, though, with Metropolis Down, could you tell us a little bit about what that's about? Because that's more of a science fiction milieu, correct?
That is a gay space horror with an second chance romance. And the plot kind of revolves around a distress signal and a ghost ship and the accidental bringing back of the horrors to this city ship that my boys live on.
Right.
It's very Dead Space, Event Horizon, and Star Trek inspired.
That seems like as far away from Blue Mountain as one can get. Where did that come from? How did that begin?
So I actually came up with the world for Metropolis Down in 2018. I was very sick at the time, and one of the only things I could do was really watch TV and write. So I ended up watching a bunch of sci-fi horror films for the first time in a long time, and read a whole bunch of sci-fi books, and it all just kind of meshed together into the world that I call the Void.
What books and what movies?
Oh my God. Event Horizon. I was rewatching Star Trek Voyager at the time. Alien, that's the biggest influence on me and on my writing for Metro. I think around that time, Alien Covenant had come out too. So I had this idea of a generation ship, but it was more, I wanted a city in a spaceship, going between the planets. I was also reading The Expanse at the time. So Leviathan Wakes is a huge, huge inspiration on me and the book. I was playing the 2017 game Prey from Bethesda Studios. It's a sci-fi shooter. So Metro is like this big mishmash of all the things I love.
Personal question that no one will care about me. Is there a cat in it? Are there any space cats? Or is it completely devoid of space cats?
There are no animals at all.
Goodness.
I know. I originally wanted there to be animals, but then I quickly realized I would have to make the animals the monsters. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. So no cats.
The next one then.
Maybe.
If I can ask, obviously it affects everyone differently, but how does your neurodivergence affect your actual writing, the discipline, the actual draft after draft, or how does it impact, if at all, the execution of your words?
So I can give a really good response to this because I wrote and rewrote Metro 3 times in 1 year while I was trying to perfect it. And it was because I was having extreme hyperfixation on this world, on the 2 main characters. I ended up writing somewhere close to 350,000 words. Almost all of it centered on these 2 boys, this world, alternate universes, while I was trying to figure out how their relationship would have started in world and what they would be like without all of the trauma of the story that I've imposed on them.
See, now I'm wondering, was it 5 drafts that are 70,000 words, or is there a 350,000 word monster version out there that goes into all the digressions and everything?
There is not. That would be amazing, though. The 0 draft was about 18,000 words, and I used that just to figure out what I wanted to do. And that was very Aliens inspired. That one was very action-y from the get-go. The second draft was about 55,000 words. The third draft was 105,000 words. And now I'm working on the finalized version, which is going to be somewhere in the 80 to 90,000 words, I think. Maybe more.
When you are creating a new character, I have this problem myself, but when you're exploring aspects of neurodivergence in your main characters, how do you not kind of default to, I did this with my last character, I want to explore this avenue? How do you create the way neurodivergence is expressed in a character and not go over ground you've trod before? Are there things that you're like, next time I want to take on this aspect, or next time I want to take on that aspect?
So with one of the main characters of Metro is more of a stereotypical autistic man. He's very intelligent, very hyperfixated on technology. He rises up the ranks pretty quickly in the ship, and he's now the executive officer. And I really wanted to write somebody who was very different from Celeste. Someone who didn't quite have her anxieties, but had a lot more stimming, a lot more trying to keep people away, because there's definitely been times in my life where I've held everybody at arm's length because I didn't want to get hurt. And there's a lot of that with Eddie. I also used Eddie to explore my own experience as a somewhat unwanted child. So he got more of my lived experiences than Celeste. Celeste kind of came to me as a vibe, as a kind of ideal person, someone who could swear her way out of a life or death situation. Right. Someone who was both confident and also allowed to be socially anxious and have people around her that understood and supported her. And Eddie doesn't really get that. He has a very standoffish reputation. People respect him, but they don't necessarily like him.
I mean, I aspire to Celeste's tenacity and courage in the face of all of these things happening, and everyone else would have just been like, I'm peacing out, I'm going back home. And there's a curiosity to her, and there's a tenacity to her that is like, I'm needed. And this is an interesting responsibility I suddenly have on my shoulders. And I was like, how is she going to reject this? And she doesn't. She goes forward. And I really, really like that about her and how you did that, because there's so many other ways stories would have taken that. Like she would have been forced into it. It's no, she understood and she comes into it and it is willing. And I really like that.
And so in Metro, it's more of the opposite, where they end up in the situation unwillingly and they have to deal with this in a Eddie, at least, is not very well prepared. His love interest, Jet, who has PTSD and was a soldier, he is better prepared for that. So Eddie has to kind of take a step back and follow someone else's lead.
You mentioned your grandfather and your uncle. Are any aspects of them in Eddie from your own observations, especially once you have your own diagnosis and you can look back at family and see where it kind of comes from? Was any of that in there, or is it just from your own experience and going forward?
I'd say it's more from my own experience than it is taking pieces of my family. Because I have very specifically not written most of my family into the books because I know some of them read my books and I don't want them to see themselves in the book. Right. Some of them may read it and see themselves there, and I can't really do much about that. But yeah, I don't really intend to put them in any character.
Now comes probably the hardest question. You said you would give us some backstory on Lorna.
This is a fun story.
I can't wait to hear it. Mountain lions are, as I said before we even started recording, I'm in Los Angeles. Mountain lions are our favorite thing here. I loved the character and I loved how loyal, familiar. I mean, honestly, love matches too, but loved Lorna and love a good mountain lion character.
Yeah, so I'm sure you remember the story that Celeste tells about seeing a mountain lion by the barn on her grandparents' farm. That happened to me.
Oh, wow.
My cousin and I were playing down by our grandparents' barn in the Smoky Mountains, and we looked through the barn and there was a mountain lion on the other side of the barn staring at us. And we stared at it for a while, and then we started screaming and ran back up to the big house.
Which is exactly what you're supposed to do, coincidentally.
Yes. So I really wanted to add that little piece of my history into the story. And then I created Lorna, who was the guide that Celeste really needed without actually being a guide.
Companion.
Yeah, companion, emotional support, comic relief too, since Celeste asks her not to eat her. Yeah.
Spoiler, she doesn't.
She doesn't, no.
Other than writing her into that, did you ever see a mountain lion again? Or has that always kind of been this moment from childhood where you're like...
No, that's just one of those core memories that I have from my childhood. I was maybe 7 at the time, so seeing this gigantic cat was very impactful for me.
And about Matches, who doesn't have quite the adventure of Lorna, but is such a beautifully drawn cat. Are you a cat person? Do you have a cat of your own? And is that Matches?
So I have 2 cats, and Matches is very much a combination of my 2 cats. She talks like my girl cat, and at the time I was writing, we had a boy cat who has since passed, and she has the energy and sass of that boy cat, because he was a very, very stubborn, very sassy cat. And so I put both of them into Matches to create this little witchy familiar for Marta.
Great cat character. You mentioned earlier, kind of well known, that autism was something that boys had. I mean, you can get medical textbooks now where that is the explanation that's in the book. And it seems nowadays people are shocked by that. It's just one of those things. And you're like, no, there are so many things that are wrong with 20th century medicine that way. And if you don't mind me bringing it up, you mentioned in the acknowledgments that you once went on a multi-page rant about how assigned female at birth autistic folks are treated differently. And I was wondering if you wanted to use this opportunity to talk about it a little, because like so many things with medicine, it's something that's not as often talked about, like with race, with gender. I was wondering if you wanted to speak about that a little bit and how that impacts your writing. So
when I first was getting my diagnosis, there was a lot of pushback from people in my family saying, oh, no, you couldn't have that. Or, oh, like, I would have known, you had that. And it really pissed me off because even in like the original session with my psychologist, who I'm still seeing for therapy, she's like, I'm pretty certain you're going to qualify as autistic. And when we went through the process and I came back for the final diagnosing session, she was like, yep, you're autistic. And I just felt so angry that little baby Vesper wasn't given the chance to be herself because she was forced into the mold of girlhood and womanhood, and people didn't acknowledge my strengths. They didn't acknowledge my struggles, and a lot of it was caused by family. I was 10 around the time that my autistic traits really became a problem, so to speak. And instead of getting me therapy or anything else, my parents sent me to boarding school. So,
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. And that was their fix for me, is they'll send me somewhere and let, a military style structure fix me. And it did, in a way. It helped me find my own, it helped me figure out a way to hide myself. It helped me protect myself for a very long time. It helped me see my potential intelligence level, but it also made me realize that people would ignore everything else about me just because I was useful for making the school look good, because I had nearly perfect grades. I got into a really good college. I did all these extracurricular activities because I felt like I had to do it to make people happy and like me. And then when I left for college, I just had like a 2-year breakdown.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm trying to learn how to be a person outside of the structure. And my parents' reaction to me almost failing out of college was them trying to force me to go into the military. And I was like, you can't do that anymore.
Right.
I am the person who decides where I go and what I do, not you. So a lot of the rant and the acknowledgments of the original version of Blue Mountain was directly and indirectly against my family in the way that they treated me and their refusal to believe that I was autistic, because in a way that would mean that they had to admit that they screwed up.
Right. When my child was diagnosed, my own mother, who has her own things, said, oh, no, just drop her off with us for 3 days and we'll fix her. And I was like, you will never see her. She was like, no, because I'm a school teacher.
Oh my God.
Give us a 3-day weekend and we'll take care of this. And I was just like, that's really just never going to happen. So there's a generation that just, I don't know, thinks they know what autism is, and nothing will change their mind about it. So,
and they're very wrong.
Yeah. I mean, my God, the last 2 weeks have been kind of
It's
swirl.
been so stressful.
Yeah.
Oh.
And now there's a registry, which is the one thing that my mother was kind of right about. She was like, we will never put your diagnosis anywhere, because she thought I'd be relegated to different schools.
Mm-hmm.
And also it would screw with medical insurance. And she was absolutely right. I mean, as negative as she was about autism, she was right that it would cost you later in life, that there would be this thing. So I kind of wrestle with that as it's like, oh, wow, the eugenicists have caught up. And it's like, oh, okay, so we hope.
Yeah. I was talking to my husband last week when one of the bits and pieces of news dropped that I thought my mom was quietly saying, I told you so. Because she didn't think, she at one point admitted I could be autistic when I brought up very specific examples. And she's like, but well, you shouldn't get diagnosed because you don't want that on your medical history. And I'm like, but what if I need assistance in the future? And she had no response to that. But I'm sitting here like, she's got to be like a cat getting into the cream.
Right, for all the wrong reasons.
For all the wrong reasons, yeah.
Oh. move away from that a bit. I know you said you're working on Metropolis Down now. How far ahead do you work? Do you only work on like one book at a time and you're going to finish this? Or are there other projects that you're already kind of working towards and working on?
So I am currently working on a prequel to Metropolis Down, which is the romance, like the fluffy, cute romance for my space boys. I'm working on the rewrite of Out on the Ice, and I'm starting to think about what's beyond those two projects, because one of them will come out next year and the other one might. But I really want to get into the habit of thinking further ahead, because Metropolis Down has taken me, it'll take almost 3 years by the time it comes out in October to wrestle with this gigantic book and this project that's been a passion project for me since the start. And I don't want to get stuck into the schedule of only putting out a book every 3 years. So I'm trying to think further ahead. Metro is the first in a 5 to 7 book series. So I'm thinking about the sequel to that. I'm also thinking about a novella in the Valley. That'll be more spooky folk horror stuff. But once I am done and have turned in my manuscript for edits, I will pick the next book, essentially.
What is the plot of Out on the Ice, since I don't know that one?
So that one, it is actually set in the Valley. It is a cave horror story along the lines of The Luminous Dead or The Descent. And is somebody, the autistic MC decides against any better judgment to explore a cave that she's never seen before. And it follows her through what looks like a natural cavern and then into something that is extremely unnatural, and the creatures that live there.
Is that something you've also done? Have you gone spelunking and been against your better judgment?
No, I've never done it like outside of a tour or anything like that. I'm not that adventurous, but I've always found caves to be fascinating, scary. I watched a lot of videos about cave diving and spelunking when I was younger, and it just always kind of struck me as this very other place that is, for me at least, very close by, because there's like 85 caverns within a couple hours of me, something like that. The Appalachians and the Blue Ridge Mountains are full of caves.
But no interest in just being like, just one, just a little. Okay.
I watched The Descent. I know what could happen.
Right. When you plot a 5 to 7 book series, I mean, that's the next decade of your life. Is that, it's not something that I can do, certainly, but you've met your characters and you say, I can live with these people for a decade. I can write. There's enough mind. There's enough build that this is 10 years of writing.
So the sequel to Metropolis Down will actually follow a different group of people who are involved in a different aspect of the universe, because there's space archaeology in the Kuiper Belt. And this is following a group of archaeologists who are kind of like a social media phenomenon. They have this very contrived appearance and vlogs that are really just produced TV shows. And the sequel will follow a pair of lesbians, one autistic, through this event that I'm going to put them through, which is kind of Stargate-y.
Got it.
The book after that will star another group of main characters, and then book 4 through the end will be all of them coming together to fight the big evil, basically.
So space archaeology, are you interested in exogeology or archaeology, but it's extraterrestrial exoarchaeology, I guess would be off-planet archaeology. What's your interest in that? Or where did you...
I took some archaeology classes, some history of like Stone Age Europe. I took a bunch of those classes when I was in college, and it just kind of stuck with me, as a lot of random things have. As something that would be more interesting to me in a different context. So I'd have to explain like the whole backstory for Metropolis Down, and I don't think we have time for that. But basically, there was a super advanced alien race. They did experiments on humans, and they scattered humans all over 3 different systems. And the archaeologists are basically digging up the remains of those experiments.
and tracking back the story of the human evolution and civilization.
So they're actually more interested in figuring out who the gods were.
Right.
This super advanced civilization of aliens. They want to know who they are and why they came here, why they abandoned us, which is going very much back to Prometheus, the movie.
For neurodivergent characters in your work, if I can ask, when you're writing these things, especially with writing a Blue Mountain, what about Celeste's neurodivergence is the reason why she was able to do what no one else do? We kind of touched on this a second ago, but I realized I wanted to talk more about the quest aspect of Blue Mountain, because I don't think a lot of people could have succeeded in that. Do you think it is? That's why she was able to get through?
I think she became fixated on this folklore in this area that she knew, but she didn't know anything about. So I think it was part fixation and part just sheer stubbornness, sheer, feeling like she found something that she was uniquely qualified to do despite not really understanding what she was agreeing to.
And is that similar than what you bring into Metropolis Down, that I guess an acceptance that things can be much bigger than a narrow read of the universe would allow you to dream into a situation? Is that what helps them also?
It's forced on Jet and Eddie in Metropolis Down, and together they're able to come to terms with that and push forward. But they've broken up before the book, and they have to deal with this universe-shattering truth that they end up learning while also navigating their own feelings. So I really wanted to make it a bit more complex this time, because Celeste's feelings are they help with the plot, but they're not, I wouldn't say that they are the main drive of the plot. And in Metro, their feelings are much more integral to the story itself.
Other people who are reading you said that there are people who are reading you and they're like, oh, I recognize this in myself. I want to go get a diagnosis. What would you tell people who are younger, who want to write about this and want to write about their own neurodivergence? What kind of advice would you give to younger writers who are looking for ways to explore it in themselves?
I would definitely say to use fantasy, sci-fi, something speculative, because writing it in a contemporary setting might end up causing or bringing up more trauma than, especially now with everything that's been happening over the last couple of months. And I would also say to put them in a situation where the neurodivergence will help them either fix something or complete the quest, just not put them in a position where they are continued to be pushed aside and victimized.
You mentioned Mira Grant, someone else who has written about in Wayward Children, the boys are recognized when they're acting in a certain, when they're quiet, when they're not being, and that's why girls got underdiagnosed. And I've always really liked that from Wayward Children. And I've always been kind of like, oh, McGuire really writes well, and I aspire to read more of that. Are there other contemporary writers other than her or others that you're reading and you're like, that's really well executed, that's really well done? Are there people that you're seeing now who you 100% on?
I have a bunch of indie writer friends who write autistic characters, and I definitely think that they're doing a very good job of portraying autism as just a part of lives as opposed to a problem. Then author C.G. Drews, they do young adult horror, and their books have autistic main characters. And I read the one that's coming out later this year, and I felt so seen, as like teenage me would have probably cried reading the book.
What's the title?
It's Hazelthorn. I haven't read their other book, Don't Let the Forest In, but I'm expecting that to be similar.
Thank you for doing this with us today.
Of course.
I read a ton, and when I read Blue Mountain, I was just kind of like, oh, here's this, where you just kind of are wrapped up in the story, yes, but also just the writing, sentence to sentence and word to word. And that's my favorite kind of sensory writing. So I was really glad that you would agree to talk to us a little bit today about your work. So
yeah, of course. Thank you for asking me. I definitely wasn't expecting that when I got your email, that first email that you sent me. I'm always glad when people tell me that the sensory aspects of my stories come through well in my writing, because I put a lot of effort into that. And also it comes naturally, but sometimes you have to explain it differently, if that makes sense.
It does. When is Metropolis Down coming out? What is the date?
October 7th. There are pre-orders available on my Ko-fi shop and on itch.io.
Which is where I just got your the bundle for the...
Oh, you got my bundle.
Oh, yeah. I downloaded it. As I say, I never stop reading. So I was like, and I just started downloading all of those onto this.
Some of my favorite books are in that.
Oh.
I was so happy to put it together. I'm friends with most of the people in that bundle. I also have a space horror anthology coming out on the 13th of May that I curated.
Right now. What's it called?
It's called Astrophobia, an anthology of space horror. It's 13 stories of horror beyond Earth, and not necessarily neurodivergent, but several of the authors are neurodivergent. Most of us are queer in one way or another. And it's just been a really fun project to work on.
You mentioned that you're friends with the people in your bundle. What is it, social media? How do you reach out to other? I have a podcast. I email one person at a time. I'm very isolated. I don't have a big, like Kin is my social circle. How do you form a community when, like, kind of bar none, especially with myself, neurodivergence is just no way. There's no social interaction that I can actually deal with another human being. It's
almost all online. People I've met online and then I start talking to on Discord or WhatsApp. A lot of it is trading books, talking about each other's depictions of neurodivergence in our books, talking about the news.
Right.
Having someone to commiserate with about that. If you're on social media and you say, I'm autistic, and you start doing things for like autism acceptance months, like the bundle, or just being out about it, never not saying that you're autistic, always putting it in graphics and, talking about the different ways that your characters are neurodivergent. You kind of just meet people that way. At least I have.
Again, thank you for being on our, whatever the heck the show ends up being. Ken and I have always had kind of this, obviously Ken does a lot of podcasts. I still don't know what the show is, but it is just people talking about writing and autism, which is my favorite thing to hear about. So thank you again for being so open with us today.
Of course. Thank you. It was fun.
And that was Vesper Doom. You can find Vesper on Instagram at Vesper Doom, VesperDoom, all one word, on Blue Sky at vesperdoom.com. And a reminder that Metropolis Down hits October 7th, 2025, and is available for pre-order now at vesperdoom.com with options for autographed copies with art prints, badges, and bookmarks as well. Astrophobia, an anthology of space horror with stories by folks like K.F. Atkinson, Carolina Cruz, Joe Butler, and Vesper Doom, arrives on May 13th. See you next time. This is NDAF. NDAF is produced by Ken Plume, and our theme song is by Mike Furman.